Okay, welcome everyone to the second virtual New England Student Research Symposium on Statistics and Data Science. This symposium has been organized by the Boston chapter of the American Statistical Association, also BUCASA, Boston University Student Chapter, Bentley College Student Chapter, and Tufts Student Chapter. So we're happy to see all these people here. And first of all, before I say anything else, I wanted to tell you all that we should all be very grateful to Shannon Stock, who has put a lot of effort into organizing all this and who's taken the lead on almost everything. I am going to not mute anyone, but please mute yourself as long as you're not the speaker or asking a question so that it's easier to understand everyone. And well, let's just now welcome our keynote speaker, who is Andrew Therriault, and he has done many things in statistics and data science. They say that for statisticians and data scientists, we can watch into everybody's backyard. Well, Andrew Therriault has seen a lot of backyards, and he is going to tell you about his journey, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has seen in his journey. Thank you so much, Andrew Therriault, for accepting our invitation to speak here, and I will give the floor to you now.
Great. Thank you, Judith, and thank you all for being here. Glad to spend my Saturday morning with you. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. All right, can everybody see that okay? Good. So I'm going to go pretty quickly about the introductory bio, mostly because this is a presentation that'll go into a lot of this stuff in detail. But the basic setup here is that I'm a data scientist, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. I came out of academia, but back in 2012, decided to leave the research world and go into the applied world and do other kinds of research. And since then, I've done a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But so why should you care? And that is a really important and valid question to ask, because basically, you know, if you want to hear some white dude in tech talk about himself for 30, 40 minutes, you can go to any bar or coffee shop in Cambridge any day of the week and get that. So why is my story interesting? Well, I mean, I find it interesting because it's mine, but I think others do too, in part for a couple of reasons. One is the things I've done. So I've run the data science team for the Democratic National Committee. I ran the City of Boston's analytics team. I teach, I've got my own company. Those are the things that brought me here. That's why I have, you know, some level of professional reputation at this point, and why others think it's an interesting story to tell. But for me, what's interesting about it is actually the fact that how I got here, it feels really random to me. You know, I didn't have a plan along the way. If you looked at the list of things I've done and said, oh, well, he planned this, that would be crazy. There's a whole lot of different things, and it's been really fascinating to live this journey. But it's also been very strange and unexpected and hard to plan for. And I think the interesting thing about this story is recognizing, you know, that's not uncommon. That's how most careers work. Nobody told me that when I was getting ready. I think, you know, I started out thinking, okay, well, I'll set my goals and I'll work towards them. But life doesn't always work out that way. And so, you know, I think I've learned a lot of things as I've gone that will hopefully be helpful to other people. And I'm going to walk you through some of the steps in that story. Or for those of you who might be Parks and Rec fans, I feel like the Andy Dwyer of data science. So, you know, it is how I got here, and it seems to be working out for me, but sometimes I'm kind of surprised. But I do want to talk about something I think is important to acknowledge. You're all from a statistical background, so I'm guessing a lot of you will know this image, but if you don't, it's a pretty classic one used to illustrate a concept called survival bias. And it comes out of a story from the 1940s, where Abraham Wald, a statistician working with the US government, was helping the US Army Air Force figure out how to better protect its bombers. And the conventional wisdom was, you know, when bombers come back, They look to see where they have damage and that those are the areas where they should be, better armored and protected. But Abraham Wald recognized, hey, wait, that's exactly wrong. The data they had was from bombers that made it back. They didn't see data from the bombers that crashed over Germany and France. And what he realized was that, when we look at this chart of where there's damage, the places that have damage on those bombers that are making it back, the wingtips, the tail, and all that, that did some damage, but ultimately it wasn't critical. They were able to make it back. The places they weren't seeing damage, like the engines and the cockpit, it's not that they had some magic force field around them that kept them from getting damaged. What happened was if a plane got hit there, it didn't come back. And so his recommendation was the opposite. He said, if we're not seeing damage in a place, that's where we need to reinforce, because the reason we're not seeing it is because that's where it's most critical. And I bring up this illustration because I'm also really aware of the position I'm coming from when I'm talking about my own history. Along the way, I've definitely faced some challenges of my own, and it hasn't always been easy, but at the same time, I'm here now. I've made it. I'm one of those bombers that made it back. And so the things that I'm talking about, they might have been challenges, but they weren't critical. They didn't stand in my way and keep me from having success. And I'm very conscious that the challenges I've faced, they haven't, shall we say, they have not been the same ones that a lot of other people will face. That things like systemic discrimination, I really haven't had to deal with that in my life. Others will have a harder road than I have. And, it'd be really pretentious of me to say, I can tell you how to navigate that. I can talk about the things that I know about, and that's what this talk is going to be. For those kind of topics, though, I'd highly recommend looking at people from backgrounds who have had to experience that and get guidance from them. I think the things that I'm going to talk about are pretty universal, but there are other issues that people will face that I haven't. And so, I want to acknowledge that and recognize that my journey has been unique to me. There's some universal things, but also every one of you is going to have a different time, and we should, recognize the challenges everybody faces along the way. So that said, where are we going? So we're going to start out just going through the history. I'm going to look at not only what I've done and where I've worked, but how I got those roles, and also importantly, why I left them. Because I think everybody's career path, it's not just about why you found a job or how you got it, but also why you decided to move on from the last one. Why did you decide it was time to make a step forward? And then that's going to go pretty quickly because we have a lot to cover. But then I want to talk about what are the lessons that come out of that. What are the stories that are common across those different experiences, and how can you translate that into your own world? I've got a few additional thoughts that I think are worth keeping in mind as you get started in your careers. And then we've got some time so that, if any of you have questions, either about my own experience, my opinion, really anything you want to bring up, we'll save a few minutes at the end to deal with that. So let's get started. So where did I come from? Well, going back to the origins of my career, really have to start in the 2004 presidential campaign. So I had moved out to Ohio, lived on a friend's couch just outside of the Kent State campus. And I walked around with a clipboard and talked to people, registered them to vote, collected their information for get out the vote efforts. And at the end of that, I realized, I loved working in politics and I hated talking to strangers about it. So I tried to figure out what I could do to work in politics that didn't require that. And so I didn't quite know what that was. And so I wound up in grad school. And the funny thing is the reason I wasn't able to figure out what that job was, the job that I wanted didn't exist when I went to grad school. And it turned out the job I wanted was basically political data science. So I got lucky because it existed by the time I finished, and I was suddenly pretty well positioned to enter that field. When I was in grad school, I was studying things like public opinion and experimental research and statistical modeling and survey methods. And those are exactly the kind of skills that I ended up using in my career in the years after that. But so when I graduated from my PhD at NYU, I went and spent a year at Vanderbilt. And if you ever have a chance to do a one-year postdoc, I would highly advise don't. because what I found was that, I started this job, immediately started looking for the next one on the academic job market. I spent 5 or 6 months just focused on that. And then at the end of it, it didn't work out. And so then I had to figure out, okay, what's my backup plan? So I didn't get to really use much of the time to just focus on research like I had hoped to. So in May of 2012, that's when I decided, okay, it's time to go. I'm going to go get a job outside of academia. And so that took me to Los Angeles. I joined a startup called Pivotal Targeting, and we had an offshoot called Lightbox Analytics as well. It was a small company that focused on doing data science and analytics that was founded by a couple guys from Caltech. They'd been working on the Obama campaign as consultants. They got another client, decided to start a company with that, and then I was their first hire. And so I did a little bit of everything. I did some research, some survey design and analysis, a lot of client work, but also I was doing a lot of the business development and operations. And, even I was working on things like graphic design for logos. And that's kind of how startups are. Everybody does a little bit of everything. But so I got that job simply because one of the founders was somebody that I knew through the political methodology world. He was actually the editor of Political Analysis, the main political methodology journal, and he was a good friend of my grad school advisor. And it was about 1.5 years that I worked there. It was a really interesting time, but like happens to many startups, it ran short on cash. Things seemed a little tenuous. And basically I hit a point where I realized, if things go under, I had no other reason to be in LA. I didn't have, family or close personal connections. And it wasn't a great place to be doing data work back in 2012 or 2013. There wasn't much of an industry out there. Since then, there's actually been a burgeoning tech industry there. It's no Boston or San Francisco or New York, but there are a lot more opportunities now than there were back then. So we had a client that was based in DC that I'd been working with for a few months, and I was their main consultant. And I happened to be in DC for a friend's wedding, decided to have an in-person meeting, and just happened to let slip that I'd been thinking of moving back to the East Coast. I'm from Boston originally, and they made me a job offer 2 days later. That was very much intended, and we kind of understood it was much more efficient for them to pay me as staff than as a consultant. And so they made me an offer, and I packed up and I moved back to the East Coast. So that client was a survey firm called Greenberg Quinlan Rosner Research. They're one of the big Democratic polling firms. There are a lot of different groups that you all have heard of who are our clients. We also did some interesting international work. For example, we were doing polling and modeling for the UK Labour Party, and even did some work in some interesting places like Moldova and Estonia and Ireland, and places where you normally don't get a chance to do political work when you're based in DC. So it was an interesting time. And I was basically the senior data scientist on the company's analytics team. So what that meant was, I did some survey research, a lot of statistical analysis and modeling of surveys, some micro-targeting work where, I'd use machine learning to identify potential supporters, or, find ways to do things like coding open-ended text responses in surveys to find common themes and quantify support or opposition for a specific ballot measure or awareness of something that people were voting on that year. So did a bunch of interesting projects, but it was very much a consulting role where I worked a little bit here, a little bit there. It was building out a program for this organization, but ultimately I wasn't doing any one particular thing or had ownership of anything in particular. And so I was there for about 9 months. And the reason I left had nothing to do with that job in particular. It was just that I got an offer that I really couldn't turn down. And that offer was from the DNC. So for those of you who don't know politics, the DNC is the National Democratic Party. What it does is basically supports Democratic campaigns, up and down the ballot, from everywhere from the presidency to the local dog catcher, or any local race. There are resources that the DNC provides to them, like, for example, data about voters that are really core to how Democrats run campaigns. And so I built the first in-house data science team at the DNC. The DNC had some data experience, particularly in coordination with the 2008 and 2012 Obama campaigns, but that was pretty closely tied into the presidential campaign. And so the role that I was brought in for was to take those same things that the presidential campaign had been doing and make those kind of resources available to campaigns up and down the ballot and make it something that comes from the DNC, rather than from a campaign or from some third-party outside vendor. And so we developed a lot of tools, particularly micro-targeting models for campaigns all across the country. If you were working on a Democratic campaign, you wanted to pull a list of likely Democratic Party supporters, you would go into a tool called VAN, which was the voter contact tracking system. And you could just pull a list of people based on these Democratic Party support scores that my team put together. We also did things like modeled who's likely to become a volunteer, or how are people likely to feel on any of these particular issues. And that's the kind of thing that campaigns could use to tailor their messaging when they're doing voter outreach. We also did some work with the party's own voter contact, doing things like modeling, what is the best phone number at which to reach any of the 150 million registered voters in the country. And also did things like, how do we target 1 million pieces of direct mail that the DNC sends every month in order to maximize the number of new donors we recruit onto our list. So we worked on a lot of really interesting things. And it was kind of a dream job. It was the job that I had sort of had in mind when I went to grad school, but it didn't exist back then. And it's not as if, when I left academia that I thought, oh, this is the job I want, because I was the first person in this job. There were people who did data at the DNC before, but there wasn't a dedicated team and nobody was running it. I was the first one hired. So it was sort of a dream job, but also it was sort of a mess. And I say, things were complicated when it comes to why I moved on. There's really just more than I can really put on one slide. Part of it was that, I planned to get out of politics eventually. It's a real high stress, high burnout game. There aren't a lot of people who are very far past 30 and still in the industry. It's really mostly dominated by people who are very recently out of college. But also in much more particular terms, the dynamics of 2016 played a big role. And an interesting thing about the DNC is that in a presidential election a year, because the DNC is the party's central organization, when the presidential primary is over, the winning nominee, their campaign basically takes over the DNC for the rest of the year. And in 2016, obviously that was the Clinton campaign. And so I'd been brought in part, not only to help all Democratic campaigns across the country, but also to help prepare for the presidential campaign. Because in 2012, the Obama campaign had basically 2 years to get ready. But we figured in 2016, well, the presidential campaigns are going to be fighting amongst themselves for the nomination. So we should have the DNC getting ready for that campaign to sort of pick up what we'd been working on and then run with it for the last 6 months of the election. But the Clinton campaign, they figured they had it covered. And I didn't have a great working relationship. Their team and mine, we saw things pretty differently about some methodological things, how we think about things like voter turnout. And what it became pretty clear in the early parts of 2016 was that their interest in our team was really about, what could we do for the presidential campaign in terms of like, which staff members did they want to make come up to New York? And, how can they basically use the DNC's both data and financial resources to benefit the campaign? And so what it became clear in the first few months of 2016 was things weren't going to be great for me if I stuck around. The parallel that I often give is with mergers and acquisitions of companies, where when one company buys another, what will often happen is that they'll bring on all of the new staff, but there isn't room for two sets of managers. They're not going to keep the old leadership in place because that could be giving conflicting direction to the staff under the new company. And in the same way, it was clear that if I stuck around, I was going to be pretty marginalized. And so at the same time, I got an offer for a new job that I hadn't been expecting, but which really made a lot of sense and made me decide, June of 2016 was the time I was going to leave rather than waiting till after the presidential election. So that is what brought me back to Boston. So I got an offer to become the city's chief data officer. And this was kind of a surprise. The chief data officer position was a brand new one. The city had created an analytics team about a year earlier. But at that point, it wasn't so much a team as a collection of people who did similar things and had desks near each other. And so in 2016, they decided to hire a chief data officer to bring the whole operation together. And they posted this in February or March. And I'd seen it and was thinking about it and thinking, oh, this would be a great job to have after the election. This is the sort of thing I'd like to have. And so I was at a party. It was a friend's birthday party. And I was chatting with him. I still remember it was like down at the bottom of his staircase where it's maybe 10:30 on a Saturday night. We're drinking a couple of beers. And I mentioned, I'm thinking of getting out of politics. And this is an example of something I'd like to do. And he looks at me and he says, you know who's hiring for that, right? And I said, no. He said, that's Yasha Franklin Hodge, who was the CIO of the city of Boston and also had actually come out of the political world himself. He had founded one of the major digital voter contact and fundraising companies in democratic politics. And he was also a really good friend of the guy I was talking to. He said, well, it never hurts to talk. And so he made an introduction, we talked about it. And because at that point, things at the DNC were starting to look less and less exciting, I ended up interviewing for and eventually accepting the job. And so for about 2 years, I ran the city's analytics team. We worked on a huge range of things, everything from internal performance management and analytics to geospatial analytics, open data, data engineering, really kind of everything in Boston's government in all of these different domains that involves data. We had some part in it. In some cases, it was a little hands-off. We maybe published an open data set or two, but in other cases, we worked directly with a lot of different departments, as well as with the mayor's office and other administration teams to really think about how Boston uses data effectively. And that was, funny enough, like a second dream job. It was a dream job I didn't even know was a dream job till I got it. And for 2 years, it was really exciting. But for the last 6 months or so, it was decidedly less so. And the reason for that was well, there were multiple, but the biggest was that the people who had supported me and my team and bringing me on and creating that role in the first place were the CIO and the mayor's chief of staff. The mayor's chief of staff announced at, I think it was the end of August, beginning of September in 2017, that he was leaving to run for Congress. And then a couple months later, the CIO, my boss who brought me in, he announced that he was leaving. And so, I kind of recognized, okay, that's going to be difficult because especially with the chief of staff leaving, well, the way a mayor's administration often works is you've got a chief of staff saying, hey, here are all these cool things we should do. And then as a counterweight, you have a CFO or a budget director or both saying, well, we don't have the money to do that. And then somewhere in the tension between those, you figure out how do you prioritize what's really important. The problem was when the chief of staff left, he was replaced with the CFO. So basically, the guy whose job it is to say no wound up in the job of the person who's supposed to be saying yes. And of course, he appointed one of his own people to be CFO. So suddenly you had 2 no people there. And what that meant was there weren't a lot of new things happening. There wasn't funding for new initiatives. I was having a hard time filling all the positions that I was trying to fill. And what it just became clear was, I didn't have to leave, but if I stuck around, I wasn't going to be getting a lot more done. It was going to be tough from there. The other thing I also should mention, though, is, at that point, my personal life had hit a bit of a rocky point. I was actually going through a divorce. And the reason I bring this up is simply that these things play into how you make career decisions, quite frankly. And, I was working this job where local government, it doesn't pay terribly, but it doesn't pay great. And, even in the best of circumstances, it was pretty amicable, but, divorce is not an easy thing financially, going from one household to 2. And, I recognized, okay, that's probably a good time for me to take these skills that I developed, in data science and technology. They're very marketable skills. There's a lot of potential market value there. And I've been spending them in academia and politics and local government and, just kind of scraping by. And that's how I wound up at Facebook. So I took a job at Facebook after looking at a few private sector jobs. I'd also weighed offers from iRobot and Wayfair. And I'll be really honest, the reason I went to Facebook as much as anything was that it was the place that was going to solve a specific problem for me, and that problem was money. When I was thinking about leaving City Hall, one of the things I realized was my opportunities were limited by just kind of treading water financially. I mentioned earlier my background. I grew up fairly working class. Both my parents were nurses. I got a lot of financial aid for college, and then went into academia and politics and local government. So, I wasn't doing poorly, but I also didn't have anything to fall back on. There's no trust fund. There's no parents who can fund anything. If I wanted to, say, start a company, I really didn't have any resources to do that. And I didn't have the resources to take the time to figure out what I wanted to do. And so the reason I was looking at private sector jobs at that point was that, I needed to solve that problem before I could think about what do I want to build for myself. And Facebook ended up being the place that made the most sense to do that, because among many characteristics of that company, it has a lot of money and it pays people really well. And I'll just be honest, that was a mercenary choice. It was a choice to solve a problem in the moment. And I think it's very easy to be judging of that, but also, that's why most people take most jobs. I think there's a level of luxury involved in being able to make a choice about a job that's based on your personal fulfillment. Most people work jobs because they need to pay the bills. And even when you get into, these sort of high sophistication, high prominence jobs, sometimes you have bills to pay. And that's why that decision happened. So I got the Facebook job, ironically, because of Twitter. And that's a common theme. I actually got most of my jobs in one way or another because of Twitter. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But in this case, somebody that I knew through the data science community on Twitter was part of their data science team. And, we got to know each other pretty well. And when he heard I was looking for a job, he insisted on trying to recruit me. And so I was brought on to manage the Boston outpost of Facebook's infrastructure data science team. We worked with engineering teams throughout the infrastructure organization in Facebook. So we did things like working on network infrastructure and data storage and developer tools and all these different things that make Facebook run. We basically served as kind of in-house consultants to those engineering teams. As they were building and refining their tools, we're doing things like helping to use machine learning or do experimentation or track metrics or really anything that's needed to go from just writing code to really incorporating statistical analysis and machine learning into that process. So there were actually a lot of good things about the job there. I think I had a great quality of life. Obviously, pay and benefits and all that were great. But also, there were some really good people I was working with. I hesitate to say this, but it was kind of the easiest job that I've had in my career. I left the office around 5:30 or 6 every day, and I turned my phone off and didn't look at it again until the next day. A lot of the stresses that I had in politics and government, they weren't there when I was at Facebook. It was a pretty chill time, but also I was kind of bored out of my skull. And what I realized was, well, at that point, I was going through some personal stuff, and I just suddenly realized about a year into it that I wasn't getting any fulfillment out of my day-to-day work, and I needed that. I wasn't getting a chance to work on things I really cared about. I wasn't getting a chance to go out and talk about the stuff I was doing. I couldn't, for example, go out and teach. There was a lot of limitations that came with working there. And at the end of the day, I just realized this wasn't ever going to be fulfilling. It was a paycheck. It was a great paycheck, but that wasn't enough for me. So I quit. And I straight up quit. I didn't go find another job. I found a couple small projects, so I knew where my rent was coming from for the next few months, between basically a few freelance projects and saving a little bit of money and paying off some bills. And I went out on my own. And so starting in 2019, I started doing a lot of freelance work. I lined up a couple projects while I was at Facebook. One was with another major Democratic survey firm, helping them to get their methodology ready for 2020. So I did a big review of their work. I also got introduced to a state agency here in Massachusetts that was working on using data to optimize elder care services. both of those were through my professional network. The first of those, the survey firm, the managing partner of that firm was somebody that I knew through the broader political data community. The government agency was an introduction actually from my old boss at City Hall. And that's pretty common for a lot of the work that I've done since. If you look at my other clients, one of them was a digital ad targeting firm where my contact there was actually somebody who was a close colleague of mine at the DNC. I also worked with a consulting company that was introduced to me through somebody that I had partnered with back when I worked at Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner. And, that's a pretty consistent theme. I'm never looking at ads for companies that are looking for consultants. It's always through personal networks and introductions. And so a lot of the stuff that I had done years before ended up paying off at this point in my time. So right now, I'm not actually doing any independent consulting. Technically it's still an option, but right now I'm actually doing pretty much all these kinds of projects through the company that I started in 2020, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the other thing I started doing in 2019 was teaching. And I hadn't taught since I was a grad student, but I had given a lot of guest lectures, doing a lot of conference presentations and so forth, but I hadn't had a chance to really teach in about a decade. And I missed it. I enjoy teaching quite a bit, actually, even though I left academia. I enjoyed the research and I enjoyed the teaching, but ultimately the academic career path wasn't for me. But I still like the option to do that sort of thing. So I've taught 3 semester-long courses now, at 2 at Harvard, 1 at Northeastern. And in each case, they're data science courses that I got a chance to design for myself. And the focus, and every time I teach, is really around applied data science. Often what I think about is, if you're somebody graduating from one of these programs and I'm your first boss, what do I wish somebody had taught you while you were in school? And so often that means, thinking about the practicalities of doing a project, not just doing some homework sets or taking a pre-prepared data set and finding the right, technical solutions, but thinking through a project end to end and really thinking through like the big picture implications of what you're working on. For example, this week in my class at Harvard, one of the big things we talked about were all the risks involved in modeling. So things like, the risk of bias and discrimination. And, what happens if something goes wrong in your model, because your model is always going to be wrong sometimes. And so how do you account for the potential downsides of that? How do you adapt to them? How do you figure out what the trade-offs are? I really enjoy teaching those sorts of things because I think it's what distinguishes me from, some of the professors who have only ever been in academia and done things in a more, abstract context away from the applied world. So I'm still doing this, but I only do it occasionally. And the reason for that is really about bandwidth. Don't think any of you are probably surprised here that adjunct, professorships, they're not the most lucrative. I'm basically losing money every time I do it. I do it because I enjoy it. Not because it's a particularly substantial source of income, but I have to weigh that against everything else I do. And one of the things I've learned, because I'm always learning about my career, one of the things I've really learned this semester is I need to account for the time for that, because there's been actually some conflict between the time I have to spend on teaching and the time I spend on the other thing I'm doing right now, which is running my own company. So back in 2020, at the early start of the pandemic, I ended up having a series of phone calls with my friend Maxim, who was the chief data officer in San Diego when I had that role in Boston. And we got to talking and we realized, we both talked with civic tech companies that were looking for our advice about, how to use data and work with local governments. And eventually we decided to say, well, maybe there's a business here. I was already doing some consulting in that space. And so we founded a company that we called Civen to basically take our efforts and organize them a bit better, to collaborate, the two of us, but also we brought on, since a few of our old colleagues, the old chief data officers of Pittsburgh and Syracuse, and some other people we've worked with in the past. And so most of what we've done is consulting, particularly for other technology companies that are working with local governments. And our first customer was actually one of my independent consulting clients that did survey research with local government. Ironically, that was actually somebody I knew from my days in politics. He had originally been on the Obama campaign in 2008, he had started a company in the political analytics space, and I knew of him from my work at the GNC. And then after I had left there, he left that company and ended up starting this new company, which did surveys for local government, and ended up becoming one of my clients through a random conversation that we had on Twitter a few weeks into the pandemic. And he had mentioned something in response to some other post about which companies are actually doing well at that particular moment. He said, actually, we have more business than we've ever had. And so I sent him a message saying, hey, if you ever want to talk about collaborating, let me know. And 2 days later, I had a contract because it turns out they just happened to need somebody who could help with methodology. And so that became our launch customer. And then they ended up getting acquired by another company that has since become our biggest customer. And we've got a few others scattered all across the world. We've got clients in Israel and Malaysia and Thailand, as well as the US. And all of those actually have weird backstories too. Like our Malaysian clients, they came about because about 5 years ago, I was invited to a conference in Singapore, and I couldn't go, but I actually recommended they reach out to Maxim. He went, he met a bunch of people on this trip, and then one group of people he met were from this company that now are our clients 5 years later. So again, there's all these sort of random connections that somehow pay off. And long term, we're trying to build our own software for local governments, basically thinking about what are the tools we wish we had when we were in government. How do we make those a reality, because nobody else seems to be doing that, and then expand the kind of things that we did in cities like Boston and San Diego to places that don't have the scale or resources of a Boston or San Diego, and make that available to much smaller communities. So that's what I'm still doing. That's what I spend most of my time on these days. But yeah, even now, as you hear, so much of what happens with this company, again, is both seemingly kind of random, but also tied back to things that have happened years before. So how do we tie all these things together? Well, I want to go through a series of general lessons that I take away from this that I think can be applicable in your careers. So one is the importance of understanding that you can't really control what's going to happen, and you can't predict what your future is going to look like. That's a little scary. I'm somebody who likes to be in control. I like to know what's going on. I get anxious if I don't. But when it comes to your career, you really can only do so much. If you're wedded to a very specific idea of what you want, you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities to do really interesting and exciting things that you haven't thought of. And you're going to get locked into something that might not turn out to be as great as you expected. So the better approach is, rather than focus on making a specific outcome happen, is to instead create the conditions for that. And by which I mean, do the things that are going to make that more likely. So for example, I mentioned on several occasions how the people I knew years ago ended up getting me jobs or giving me consulting work. Doing that work to build those connections, years ago, I didn't know what it was going to lead to, but it ended up paying off. That said, I made a lot of connections that never paid off, but that's the job, right? That you need to create these conditions without knowing what's going to happen, and then be in a position to really leverage the opportunities that do show themselves when whatever happens down the road finally pays off. So the second thing, much more immediately, thinking about where you start. Most of you are undergrads and are going to be going out into the world, getting either your first job or your first post-college job, and wondering how to differentiate yourselves. And this is a big difference between when I got started and I think the conditions today. When I got started, there were very few data scientists and a lot of demand. And so it's really easy to get a data science job. And thinking about, going back to that slide on privilege, I mentioned that I was born in the 80s. Well, part of the reason I mentioned that is I came into this field at a time where data scientists were very scarce, and I was very highly in demand. Well, when there's scarcity, the market responds by creating more supply. In this case, every goddamn college in the country created a data science program. And so what it means now is that there's 1 million data scientists, and suddenly it's not a scarce resource. In fact, when I would post jobs for entry-level positions, I get hundreds of resumes. I'll be honest, they mostly look exactly the same. it's really hard to tell people apart when they don't have a lot of experience. Everybody's getting good at either R or Python or both, or doing some work in SQL, or learning machine learning algorithms, or experimental methods, or all of the above usually, because everybody's following kind of the same curriculum. So how do you stand out? Well, the way you stand out is actually not for those technical data science skills, because everybody is saying they have the same things. There's differences in quality there, but it's really hard to assess that from a resume. What makes you stand out is what you know as well as that. And in particular, I'm really fascinated by people who have knowledge of a particular subject area. For example, the person I hired most recently was for just a fellowship on my team. And he's still an undergrad, very talented. The thing that stood out though is he had built like this really well-regarded site and analysis tool for baseball analytics, which it's very niche, not relevant to what I'm doing. But what's interesting is it showed a level of mastery of a domain and the ability to combine subject matter expertise with technical skills that proves, okay, here's somebody who can actually execute and become really good at data science in one particular area. And despite being very junior in his career, that was something I looked at and I said, okay, I'm not going to use those specific skills, but this is somebody who can do that. And likewise, I'd recommend you do that in your careers. Figure out what interests you. If you have a chance to do it now and use those skills while you're in school, great. But even if not, I would recommend when you are looking for jobs after college, try to find them in an area that you care about, because that's going to make you more invested. It's going to make you want to learn more. And that passion will come through and kind of show in the work you do and help make you a better data scientist in the end. So a big thing is building your professional network. And the way to do this, well, there's no one way to do this. There's a million ways to do this. And I'd recommend doing a little of all of them. So things like conferences, particularly if you can present at them, are really helpful. There are also a lot of meetups you can go to. I'm a co-organizer for the PyData Boston meetup, which has a really great community of people. Some people have done really well posting on blogs. And a big one is social media. I've leveraged this a lot in my career. Almost every job I've gotten has involved Twitter to some degree or another, usually because a lot of people that I meet in the industry, I first meet on Twitter and then meet in real life. So that story about the friend's birthday party I was at, that was somebody who I had initially gotten to know when I was living out in California. And I saw him on Twitter. We knew people in common. He was posting about the work he was doing in politics. He's now the chief technical officer at Emily's List, which is a big democratic progressive organization. He was posting about his work and we started a dialogue and we became friends. And that's common across so many of the things I've done. It feels cheesy to recommend Twitter to people, but honestly, it's been a huge benefit for me. But more broadly speaking, the important thing is just building that network and getting people to know who you are and knowing who it is that you should reach out to about different things, like how to get an introduction to a job you're interested in. And I think the corollary to that is building the personal connections within your network. So I mentioned, that guy who made the intro to the CIO of Boston. He was a friend of mine. I was at his birthday party. Likewise, the person who recruited me onto Facebook, that was after we went out and grabbed drinks one night. And that happens a lot. I think you need more than just a superficial connection to people. Those personal connections that are deep, that will really help you along the way. Those are the people who are going to make introductions for you, who will give you advice, who will open up opportunities to you that you didn't even know were there. But also when you're thinking about jobs, I think it's really important not to overstress about any particular one of them. The thing to remember, the mantra is that your next job is probably not going to be your last job. And certainly your first job, if you're looking at coming out of school, is not going to be your last job, which means you don't have to get it exactly right. You're going to have some things you like about it, some things you don't, and you're going to learn from that. And eventually you're going to move on. And that's great. It's also important to recognize, and this is why I told the story of Facebook and my experience there, sometimes a job is a job. That's what most jobs are for people. There's a lot of pressure, I think, to get your dream job or be really motivated and inspired and, care about your work. But honestly, most people in the world are doing it for the money. And I wouldn't advise that as a primary motivation. And the story of my time at Facebook was that wasn't enough for me. But sometimes you do need to do that. And if you find yourself in that circumstance, you graduate from school, you have a lot of loans and you need to take a job that pays them. That's totally reasonable. Don't overthink that. Sometimes, you have a practical objective in getting a job and it's not about personal fulfillment. Recognize when that is and understand what that means, but recognize that's totally normal and you shouldn't worry about doing that if that's what you have to do. So when you're in a job, though, it's also worth thinking about whether to stay or leave before it gets to a crisis point, because I think a lot of people stress about the idea of leaving a job, that it's like a breakup, that something has to happen. But maybe this applies in breakups too, but particularly with jobs, the normal thing that happens is people leave. It's very rare somebody stays in a job these days more than a few years, and certainly not for their entire career. So the natural outcome is you're going to leave at some point. So you should normalize that. Think, okay, I'm starting this job. What do I want to get out of this? For me, that's really important, is having goals for what I want to accomplish. So at the DNC, it was building the team and putting these models that we were building out into the world, and setting the team up to be able to eventually operate without me. For me, that's really important, is to have that set of objectives. But it also means at some point I will have achieved them or hit the limit of what I can achieve. And that's when, for me, it's time to move on. You might have different criteria, but I think it's important to think about what you're okay with in a job and what's a sign that it's time to keep going, and make that choice decisively. Don't, run away as soon as a job gets hard. But I think knowing what your criteria are in advance will also actually help you make that decision where, if it gets hard for a bit, you can tell yourself, is this hard, or is this something that is just what's normal and you have ups and downs, and that'll help you make that call. You're going to have failures. It's going to be targeted sometimes. I'm not going to kid you on that. I think the important thing is to recognize that that's normal and not overreact. So, the first job I had out of academia, it was a startup that eventually was looking like it was about to go under, and I was going to be in a really bad spot. I had really high hopes. I was expecting to be a partner, and then suddenly, I might not have a job the next day. So that was unpleasant, but all you can do in that case is adapt and figure out how to learn from that situation and make the best of it. Recognize this is going to happen to you a lot throughout your career, and you shouldn't overreact. You shouldn't take it personally. Every career has its highs and its lows, and sometimes if you're in a low, you just have to be calm and think about what you're going to do next. And then the last point I want to make is about your reputation. So this is a little different than your professional network, your professional reputation. I'm talking about your reputation as a person. This will stick with you for a long time. And this is a thing to keep in mind in every interaction you have, whether it's at a conference or in your office. People remember how you treat them and how you treat the people around you. They remember, are you reliable? When they needed you, were you there? And that's the sort of thing that will stick with you. Whether, you did pretty good or amazingly at some particular project actually is probably going to be less memorable to them than, how did you treat the people around you, particularly the people who were not in a position of power. If you're in a management role, how did you treat your staff and your interns? People remember that, and that's going to really affect you for the course of your career in ways you don't even know. For example, for me, I've always taken pride in doing right by the people who work on my teams. Even long after they work for me, I still have people I worked with 6, 7, 8 years ago who call me for advice and, help when they're looking for a job or they just need somebody to talk to. That's the kind of relationships I build. And I think over time, it's become known to people that I do that sort of thing. And so the good thing is today is when I'm looking for entry-level people or interns, I have many people who are willing to send me their best staff or students because they know, I'm going to do right by them. And so it's really important to build that kind of reputation, really just be the sort of person other people want to be involved with. So finally, just a few last points. This was my career path. Your ideal should look different than that. I can't tell you what that is, you need to think about your own values. What do you care about? Not just in a job, but in your whole life. And make sure that the career path you take is based on those and isn't just what feels good in the moment. And it's particularly important to include your non-work goals because, I look at my career and I've had a lot of success, but there's been some costs too. My personal life and my health have both definitely had paid some costs for the amount of ambition I've had, the hours I've worked, the moving around and all of that. And I don't know, I'm not going to look back and say would I have done things differently, but you might want to think about those things in the future. Like, how much do you care about work-life balance? And would you rather have a job that's slightly less prestigious if it gives you more time off to spend with your family? Those kind of things are really important every day. And I know the ideal is, sure, we can have it all, but at the end of the day, even if you can have, say, a high profile job and a family and kids, the time you spend at the job is time you're not spending with your kids. And some people realize they don't want to work more than 40 hours a week. So maybe those kind of top tier jobs are a little harder to get, but they're important. The importance of that is not nearly as much as the importance of their family. And finally, once you're in your career, just to reiterate the point I made before, recognize that there's only so much you can control and plan for. And so always be ready to change course if you need to. And as you go, pace yourself. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Make sure to take care of yourself and your well-being. I mentioned my own health and relationships have suffered. It took me a long time to learn those lessons the hard way, that I needed to dial back, learn to take time off, learn to check out when I'm not actually on the clock, and try not to burn out. It sucks. I've been there. It's hard enough when you're stressed and tired, but when you get so stressed and tired that you don't care about what you're doing, it makes everything a lot harder. And then finally, the last piece is when you get to a point where you've had some success, remember to pay it forward. However you can help other people achieve their goals, do that. I look at my career, the one theme more than anything else is at every step along the way, there's been somebody else there who's helped me. And so that's why I think it's really important for me to do the same for others. And I hope someday you will do the same thing for others. So the last thing I'll say is remember how to have fun too. I've talked about a lot of serious stuff, but also this industry, it can be a lot of fun at times. And if you're not having fun, you should do something about that, because I want you to enjoy yourselves as well as have success. So with that, good luck. And we've got a couple minutes if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There are no questions in the chat, but I see that Olga Witek has a hand up to ask something. Or this is just saying hi. Salvador, you have a question, or this just
No, just
Sorry, no, I'm just applauding.
hi, and I wanted to thank Andrew for sharing the experiences, and also just wanted to say that Northeastern absolutely loved your class, and we would love to have you back whenever your schedule.
Yeah, I would love to. Just like I said, trying to keep that balance in check. So, but yeah, I will definitely be back someday. Don't worry about that.
Absolutely. And what you say is useful not just for students, for people kind of further along their career path. It's still very good to hear. So we really, really appreciate you sharing that.
Great. Well,
thank you so much.
Appreciating you give me the opportunity.
Lara, you have a question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering if you could talk more about maybe your experience and your colleagues' experience if they did it doing a postdoc, and if you would ever recommend doing a postdoc if you're not planning on immediately going into academia.
Yeah, so the thing that I recommended against specifically was a one-year postdoc.
Yeah.
Kind of an offhand comment, but I actually feel pretty strongly about that, because the problem I ran into, so thinking about the timing of the academic job market, the first application deadlines, at least in political science, and I'm assuming many other fields, are around the beginning of September. And so what that means is you spend the summer getting ready to send off these applications, working your job market paper, putting your packet together. So you do that, and if you're taking a postdoc, you also move at the same time, so that's really stressful. And then you get there, and as soon as September starts, you're constantly sending out applications, Networking, if you're lucky, you're going and doing job talks. Even before that start though, you do a lot of practice presentations, try to share your work wherever you can. And, overall, it's a really stressful and all-encompassing period. So for me, that was basically, July through January was being on the academic job market. And I get to the end of January and then it's just kind of over. And I was on the market in 2011, where, if you recall, there was a recession in 2008. And what that did was it really squeezed out the market, because not only were endowments going down, but a lot of professors at the top end saw that their retirement funds had just gotten cut in half, and they decided to stick around. And every senior professor takes up the budget of 2 assistant professors. So there were very few jobs in 2008, 2009. A bunch of people who went and got those jobs and took whatever they could get went back out on the market 2 years later, once things had started to open up. So I was going up against a bunch of people who had already had 2 or 3 years of professorship, a few more publications. Anyways, all that's to say, it was grueling. I had a couple job talks, nothing happened. And so I'm totally burnt out by the end of January. It was like my relationship had fallen apart. I wound up just kind of depressed and, alone in Nashville, and had nothing going on. And then I had to find my backup plan. And so suddenly I had to start a whole new job search in a whole new area. And I could have gone and looked for another postdoc or something like that. It would have been the same thing. I'm going to spend the next few months looking for the next job. So I ended up leaving there in May. And not that I did no work the whole year, but honestly, I probably spent 2/3 of my time just looking for a job. If you have a chance to go and do multiple years, 2 or 3, totally different story. And that was the thing, is if I had chance to actually do the research, it would have been awesome. And there were some upsides, don't get me wrong, but as a life choice, I think it was, look, I'm glad I went. I would never do it again. And I wouldn't recommend it for others, because it's a lot of disruption to pack up and move, your whole life to a new city, new job, new set of people around you, knowing that you're going to do it again a year later. That's tough. So.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
You're welcome.
So I know the next session is officially starting now, but maybe we give 1 more minute for people to jump in. Andrew, if there are no more questions of the audience, I was wondering whether you, maybe in 1 minute or so, could tell us something about the biggest statistical challenge that you met during your years as a data science?
Oh, the biggest statistical challenge, I would say, is probably overfitting and data leakage in models. So one example, I can give 2 quick ones actually. One, so I don't know if I would say this is overfitting. This might just be a selection bias problem. There's a lot of things wrong with this example, but when I was at the DNC, we made a model of volunteer propensity. Basically, we were trying to identify voters who were likely to be good prospects for volunteer recruitment. And we make this model based on past campaigns' volunteer recruitment attempts to basically predict what happens if we ask somebody to volunteer. Are they going to actually show up? Well, we publish this score, we send it out to all these campaigns, and I start getting phone calls. And all these campaign managers, they realized, hey, wait, why are so many of these top targets Republicans? And I looked at this and I was like, my first thought was, oh crap, I coded something backwards, because that obviously doesn't make sense. And I looked in and my code was exactly right. I did the model perfectly. The thing I messed up was I didn't think about the data generating process. And the data generating process was looking at past attempts to recruit people. And the thing I hadn't thought about was, when does a Democratic campaign try to recruit a Republican to volunteer? The answer is that they only ever do that if they know the answer is going to be yes. If somebody has signed up already at an event, or they're on a mailing list or something like that, if there's some reason to know that that person is not a typical Republican and are actually a supporter, then you'll ask. You will never ask a random Republican. So the thing is the model was perfectly accurate for the training set. That is, all the Republicans there were great targets. Obviously, that doesn't apply for Democratic campaigns in the real world. So at the end of the day, the only way to fix that was basically I just put a filter on partisanship and said, all right, there's a condition of being a good target, which is you have to be a likely supporter. But yeah, it was a really instructive example. The other one, really quick, data leakage, was we were doing fundraising targeting for direct mail fundraising. And we'd done this for a few months. We do it every month. We get updated data. And one of the data sources we got was from this like anonymized donation data for all sorts of different nonprofit organizations. And so basically these organizations like share data with this collective like data vendor, and then they package it up together to say, are you a donor to animal rights causes or healthcare charities or, like progressive leaning nonprofits? Well, what happened is we were using this for a few months, and then one month I'm basically running every month. I always like push it to the last minute. I was up all night running this model, and at like 4 a.m, before I have to send in a targeting list at 9 a.m, I realized, wait a second, there's something wrong with this. And it turns out, without telling me, somebody in another department of this organization had started sharing our data with this company that aggregates it and anonymizes it. And so it turns out, I was modeling whether or not people donated to us if we asked them, but in the data we had, there was this anonymized variable which included our own donation records. And so suddenly the model got really good, but in a way where if I had not caught this and I'd sent it out, would have been totally useless, because we were trying to find new donors. Those people who are already our donors, they didn't count. And so, this was going to be 1 million, I think it was about 1 million, 2 pieces of mail. We would have wasted literally like millions of dollars on this fundraising mailing to a totally worthless model if I hadn't just happened to catch it at random at 4 a.m, because turns out the model was actually too good and I got suspicious.
Very, very cool. I think we can thank the speaker again, because
Great. Well, thank you for having me. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and enjoy your day. You're welcome to hang out if you want. There are going to be interesting student presentations also, but you may have other plans.
Yeah, I may drop in and out throughout the day. But if I don't talk to you later, thank you again.
Thank you so much. Salvador Balcous from the University of Massachusetts, the program in data science, is going to chair the next session. Everyone has screen sharing privileges, but please don't use them unless you need them. Take care.
Awesome. Thank you. So yeah, this first session will be biostatistics. Students will be presenting their research. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes